So everyone, we are here again for another Meet the Candidate special, and I am sitting with Jake Auchincloss. Jake, thank you so much for joining us today.
Brett, it's a pleasure to be on. Thanks for having me.
Jake, I want to start with a little different for you than I have with everyone else because I found a quote that you have, and I'd like to read it for you. And because I think it sums up a lot of on your website and a lot of the things that you're talking about your past. It says, public service, then, ties together three threads for me. On my dad's side, it's a tradition, an expectation. On my mom's side, it's an obligation, a way to give back. And for me, personally, it's my source of meaning. Can you tell me about that quote?
Absolutely, and it's one that's deeply personal to me. So I grew up in a family that was really pulled on two different sides of the American story. On my mom's side, we were the descendants of emigres from the Russian pogroms before World War I. My mom was the granddaughter of Arnie and Clara Glibscher, who moved to Chelsea, fleeing persecution of the Jews. And my mom's dad walked into a Marine recruiting office in 1942, and he was a poor, skinny, 17-year-old Jewish kid. At the time, the Marine Corps was losing the war in the South Pacific. And the Marines sent that kid to Purdue to study engineering, turned his life around. He goes on to become a nationally prominent scientist. His daughter, my mom, goes on to become the head of the Dana-Farber, the first female to be the president and CEO of the Dana-Farber. It's an only in America kind of story. And I grew up thinking about the obligation I had as someone who had benefited from the US government having its priorities straight and our willingness as a country to invest in those who are marginalized or left behind, as a poor Jewish kid in 1942 was. And so when I graduated from Harvard in 2010, I joined the Marine Corps. It was my way of giving back. But it was also a deeper element of public service to me. On my dad's side, I had grown up having dinner with my grandmother every Sunday. And she would talk to me about her brother and her dad's service in the Roosevelt and Kennedy administrations. And she would talk about her own service in New Jersey as a pioneering woman in New Jersey politics. And she made me think of politics as something that you could be proud of. And it sounds quaint these days, given the rhetoric we're seeing at the national level. But I grew up thinking politics could actually be a force for good. And so after leaving the Marine Corps, when I was thinking about what to do next with service, to me, it was my hometown. It was working on the city council. And I've since become the chair of public safety and transportation and have done a lot of work with coalitions on housing and transportation and the environment.
That's fantastic. One of the things I wanted to point out is obviously you growing up, you have that deep history. And I actually wanted to point something out because I saw this on your website, which people can go to. It's jakeforma.com. Great website. Love the whole setup, love all the information that's available, and very detailed, by the way. All of your plans have tags to more information, more things to look at. You usually have some bill that's out there that people can go and look into. So a great resource for people to find information on, not just what you think, but also why you think that way. So I definitely appreciated that. But one of the stories that I saw was that unlike most kids when they're growing up and what they put on their wall, you had a handwritten Declaration of Independence on your wall?
I handwrote the Declaration of Independence on my bedroom wall when I was in second grade. It was somewhat a testament to my second grade teacher, who actually, when the Boston Globe endorsed me, she wrote a letter to the Boston Globe as well, saying that she thought they made the right choice because she and I have stayed in touch. But she was one of the first people to give me the spark that has since become a lifelong passion for American history and for the story of our American experiment. I was reading books about the founding and about the founding fathers and about the Civil War and the Civil Rights era. And the Declaration of Independence has always been a touchstone for me, that promise, always unfulfilled, but always ever closer if we're moving forward, that all men and women are created equal. And that's really the creed that drives me.
We actually have a declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence on our site now too, so you can go check that out. But you obviously, one of the biggest things, you graduate, you went into the Marine Corps as well. Can you tell me about the Marine Corps, your service? You went to Afghanistan and Panama. You were a captain in the Marines. Tell me about leadership. And I want to specifically know about that 3 a.m. leadership.
I commanded a platoon in Afghanistan in 2012. This was during the surge to Helmand province. Was honored to lead Americans from all walks of life, all parts of the country, all races, all creeds. And were united by a common mission. I was then able to command another platoon to Panama, in 2014. This was a special operations mission, and this required working with the Colombians and the Panamanians on interdicting drug patrols. This mission was conducted in Spanish, which was definitely a reach for me. My high school Spanish was a bit rusty at the time, but they were two very different experiences. They were two experiences that threw into high relief what I think of as the strengths and weaknesses of American military policy. On the one hand, our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have been failures. As the US Inspector General said, the American people have constantly been lied to about Afghanistan. And that futility was apparent to me on the ground in 2012. We need to end the forever wars. We need to stop spending and adding to the $6 trillion that have been wasted overseas. We need to quit the bloodshed that has cost thousands of American lives and tens of thousands of Central Asian and Middle Eastern lives. And we need to refocus on domestic priorities like education, infrastructure, healthcare. And we also need to refocus our foreign policy towards the containment of China geostrategically. These Middle Eastern wars have been a bloody and expensive distraction for us for too long. And I would make it a priority of mine to repeal and replace the authorization for the use of military force. But also, I've seen the strengths of American military policy in a place like Panama, where we spent 1 month doing a mission that was training host country forces. And 5 years later, they're still doing it. And we're long gone. That is a much higher leverage use of American military forces. And I just want to address the 3 a.m. comment that you made. One of the things you're taught in Marine officer training is 3 a.m. leadership. The idea that invariably you're going to get bad news one night as a platoon commander, and it's going to be at 3 a.m. You're going to be disoriented, tired, cold, hungry, and the Marines are going to look to you for a decision. And you're not going to have all the information that you need. And you're going to be gripped by anxiety. You're going to be afraid of making the wrong decision. But ultimately, leaders need to act. And I think right now we are a country adrift. We are a country that sorely lacks leadership. And we are all suffering because of that lack of leadership in overlapping crises to do with the economy and public health and racial justice. And more than ever, we need people who are used to the pressure and who have the resolve to make hard decisions, to forge coalitions, and to finally rebuild this country.
Jake, obviously public service, a huge part of your life. You come out 2015, you're elected to the Newton City Council. I want to talk about the things as city councilman, the things that you've done. And you've done a lot. There's a lot of the progressive motions that you're talking about today. If people go to jakeforma.com, a lot of the priorities, a lot of the ideas that you have are things that you've already been doing as Newton City Councilman. You're the chair of the Transportation and Public Safety, which you highlight puts you in charge of police reform, which is one of the things that is really important, obviously, as people see it today. Tell me about the transportation and public safety.
Absolutely. And when you're running a campaign for Congress, you've got to build a full district base of support, but you've got to start with where you're from, right? Where people know you. And I'm proud to say that right when I launched this campaign last fall, I immediately got a huge portfolio of support from the president and vice president of the city council, the chair and vice chair of the school committee, and about 50 other elected and community leaders in Newton, including 8 out of the 13 women on the Newton City Council who have seen me in action on progressive issues. And I think the key word with all my actions on the city council has been coalitions. In politics, and especially in the legislature, you just don't get things done unless you can build a coalition of people. And sometimes it's hard to campaign on this angle, because when you're campaigning, sometimes the incentive is to say, well, I'm just gonna do this. And it's a great talking point and it's a great promise to make. As someone said, you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. Well, I've done both. I understand how to do both. And the prose part of governing is coalition building. On transportation, I've built coalitions to try to get us to a mixed use format of development with multimodal service, not just reliant on cars, so that we have a lower carbon footprint and more walkable villages. On the environment, I have been 100% aligned voter with Green Newton priorities, ranging from solar panels to municipal electricity aggregation, for issues that really move Newton towards a sustainable future. In Newton, I co-docketed the Welcoming City Ordinance, which made Newton a sanctuary city and allowed us to be more inclusive and welcoming to everybody, regardless of where they were born. And on the issue of police reform, I have held the police department to account to reach the 8 Can't Wait Campaign Zero criteria for better training and requirements for how police use force. I have called out the police department when I've seen instances that look like racial profiling to me. And I helped quarterback the formation of the Independent Police Reform Task Force, which is spending a year now to examine bottom up public safety in Newton through the lens of racial justice.
Yeah, I was definitely going to ask you about the welcoming city. That was something that you strongly supported. Obviously, you said you co-doctored it. The other two things that I actually wanted to talk to you about is the affordable, walkable housing. Is you actually, I know it was Washington Place, I believe, was what it is in Newton. That's something that here in Medfield, affordable housing, obviously something really important, but the idea of it being walkable is something with obviously keeping communities green, a big one of that. And speaking of green, Medfield loves its green space, and you actually talk a lot about the Four Corners as well, is something in Newton that you were a part of. Tell me about those two initiatives.
Sure. So walkability is a really important paradigm for me when evaluating development. We want to develop our city, I believe, here in Newton, I think really throughout Massachusetts, in a way that allows people to be untethered from the requirement to have a car. I think a car is going to be a requirement for a lot of different types of commutes or errands going forward, but we want to give people options. And I think a really healthy option is to be able to walk to basic amenities, which means residential and retail on the same general footprint, and having infrastructure that's much safer for cycling and walking. That does a number of things. One is it reduces the carbon footprint of any given acreage and for any given density of people, which is a really important element of getting to a carbon neutral future for Massachusetts. Two, it reduces congestion, because one of the reasons here in Massachusetts we have such terrible congestion is that you got to drive everywhere, and everyone's got to drive in a single occupancy vehicle everywhere. And as a metro region built on cow paths, that just ain't going to cut it. We got to have a way to get people through either mass transit or just through walking. As one person says, the best transportation strategy is usually a land use strategy. And then finally, it's just more pleasant. It builds healthier communities when you're able to see your neighbors and you're able to see small business owners in sort of your daily activities. I think especially in the midst of a pandemic and a lockdown, we're all recognizing how important those social connections are, how important those serendipitous bump interactions you have with people outside your home are, and walkability really supports that.
Like I said, I wanted to talk about the things that you've already done and then get into the things that you're talking about doing as congressman. This is where jakeforma.com, you go to the priorities page, you can start to go through all the things that you actually have. Talking specifically about transportation, as we just were, a good segue is to your idea to reinvent transportation with a new Eisenhower plan. Tell me about the new Eisenhower plan.
So as many of our listeners will know, the original Eisenhower plan was about highways, and it was an important piece of civic infrastructure in the 1950s. It helped knit this country together, but it's not what we need in the 21st century. We've got lots of highways. They're congested. What we need is a public transportation system that is truly world-class. We know the elements of successful transportation policy. We've seen them in other world-class cities: Copenhagen, Amsterdam, Tokyo, Seattle, Seoul, Mexico City. Bus rapid transit, prioritize lanes, clean, safe, reliable, all electric regional rail with 15-minute headways, better infrastructure for cycling and walking, the walkability that we just discussed. These are things that create truly effective mass transit policy, and it should all be free. It should all be paid for partly through carbon pricing. And so a new Eisenhower plan to me is a national commitment to reinventing transportation and doing it around modalities that we know work and doing it away from single occupancy vehicles. Again, not saying that people should not use cars and do not need to rely on cars. We all clearly still do, but creating more options so that as we can pivot away from one of the largest drivers of carbon emissions in the state, which is our transportation system.
One of the other things, and this was one of the ones that, like I said, you not only just have a plan, you also have the resources to it, was the carbon pricing that you had. I thought that this was something that I haven't seen anywhere else. I don't think anyone else is really talking about carbon pricing, but you actually tagged on it on the economics of carbon tax in the United States by Gilbert Metcalf of Tufts University, the whole study that he put together. This was a really intriguing idea. Tell me about carbon pricing and how that's going to affect our state.
So I'm proud that I was the first candidate in this race to call for carbon pricing. As you say, it's not talked about enough, but it's, to me, the single most important way that we are going to get to a carbon neutral future. If we are serious about a couple of basic facts: one, carbon emissions cause climate change, and two, climate change is an existential threat, then we need to go after carbon emissions. And the way to go after carbon emissions is to price them. So here's the price per metric ton, and we're open to market-driven solutions. We're open to creating the incentives for more research and development to create other means of generating energy through renewable means. But ultimately, insofar as we're not pricing carbon, we're not actually tackling the core root of the problem. There are 7 bills right now in the House or the Senate that would put a price on carbon in one form or another. Frankly, I would work with any of those 7, because what's most important to me is that we get something across the finish line. I've got my favorites, of course, but the most important elements to me are, again, put the price on carbon, and then 2, use those dividends from carbon pricing to invest in green infrastructure and green R&D.
You also have the offshore wind, which you tagged HR 3068, which is to establish a grant for wind career training. I thought that this was great because obviously it's not enough just to say that we need wind turbines. We need you're actually looking to create jobs, create training opportunities. This is a fantastic one.
I appreciate that. And I'm proud to have the support of Pat Haddad, state representative from Taunton area, who has probably been the biggest champion of offshore wind for the South Coast. And one of the reasons she's endorsed me is that she sees in me a partner to get to a clean energy economy. We know it's going to be a transition. We know it's not going to happen overnight, but it's going to require federal and state partnership to get there. And Pat and I have already working on doing that together. We know where the holdups are at the federal level, at the Department of the Interior. We're already talking about how we can unblock those holdups. And Massachusetts stands to benefit from this transition. We have the tech know-how. We have the talented workforce. We have offshore wind natural resources. In the Atlantic is a huge generator of wind energy. We just got to put all the puzzle pieces together. And obviously one member of Congress can't do it by myself, but I can be a convener. I can get the right people to the table and hammer out our transition to a clean energy future.
So I obviously know that there's a lot to do. These races, the candidates are all over the place. So I don't want to take up too much of your time from here. But a couple more things that we want to talk about is your healthcare stance. One of the things that you talk about is build on Obamacare. And then I also thought it was really great was that you pointed out that reproductive care is healthcare, that you actually tie in, reproductive rights for women is healthcare. And that's an important thing to put together.
I grew up in a healthcare family, mom, dad, brother, sister, aunts, uncles. And so this healthcare is a personal issue to me. And before we talk about some specific policies, I do think it's important to start with some basic principles, because healthcare is so complicated that if you don't start with core principles, you can get adrift very fast. 3 core principles for me. 1, healthcare is a human right. It's not a job perk. Being ill is scary enough without having to go worry about being bankrupt because of it. Number 2, women must control their own reproductive decisions. Reproductive care is healthcare. That's how I was raised. I'm 100% pro-choice, and I'll be an absolute fighter for Title X and Planned Parenthood funding and to defend a woman's right to choose. And then number 3, investing in basic medical research and in the teaching hospitals that advance clinical care is the best way that we are going to cure disease and an important engine of the Massachusetts economy. That's a critically important fact now that we're in the middle of a pandemic and an economic recession. I think that the best way to achieve those 3 principles is to build on the success of Obamacare. President Obama passed a good law in 2010. The ACA has been thwarted at every turn by Republicans in state legislatures. And with a President Biden and a Democratic Congress, I think we could finally allow Obamacare to fully succeed, to get the final 30 million Americans the coverage they deserve, and all Americans the affordable coverage that they need, including lowering prescription drug prices. What is that going to require? It's going to require that we introduce a public option to compete with the private sector. It's going to require that we negotiate to lower drug prices. And it's going to require that we strengthen the individual mandate.
And then obviously, I also thought that this was a really interesting stance that you have. Being a Marine, you would think, you know, it comes with all sorts of territory, but you're here to say that, hey, people do not need assault rifles. You have gun safety stance. It's one that I think people deserve to know about.
Yeah, I slept, ate, trained, patrolled with an AR-15 for 4.5 years. I do not believe any civilian needs to own one of those. I'm proud to be a Moms Demand Action gun sense candidate, and I've put forward a comprehensive gun safety plan that includes universal background checks, red flag laws to keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers, mandatory liability insurance to own a weapon, and just a general toe-to-toe, chin-to-chin fight with the NRA, because what we are dealing with is a lobby that does not have the best interests of Americans at heart. We are dealing with a deeply corrupt institution, and we have got to stop playing nice with the NRA and take them on head to head.
Jake, I only have 2 more questions for you, and they're the 2 most important questions of the day. So the next one is this. You've now worked with access stations throughout. You've had interviews. You've done debates on access stations. When you win this election, you're in Congress. How do you plan on using access stations in the future? How do you plan on continuing the conversations with us?
Through interviews like these. For as long as you'll have me on, I'll be here.
That's fantastic. And then I do want to finish. It's obviously it's a great race. There's a lot of great candidates that are out there. Medfield's got a tough decision going ahead of it. But why should a citizen of Medfield vote for Jake Auchincloss?
When the Boston Globe endorsed me, they said that in a promising field, Auchincloss was the best choice. And it's because I have the ability to represent a district of haves and have-nots. My career has been defined by toughness and by the ability to build coalitions. We're going to need toughness to take on Trump and the Trumpist agenda that has threatened to destroy this country. And then we're going to need the ability to build coalitions as we heal and rebuild this country.
That's fantastic. Jake, thank you so much for joining us today. I think that you've given a lot of great reasons. There's, like I said, jakeforma.com is a great resource for our residents to go to and check out everything that you stand by, you believe in, and why you believe in it. I think it's a great resource for people. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Brett, I really appreciate you having me on.